When my phone buzzed on that Tuesday morning, 13 words changed everything. Don't come to my wedding. Watch the live stream instead. My own son had just kicked me out of the most important day of his life. But as I stood there in my kitchen, watching coffee spill across my counter, something fierce woke up inside me. The woman I used to be before grief made me small and quiet. The mother who would fight heaven and earth for her child. I had no idea that my son was walking into the biggest trap of his life, or that his perfect bride was hiding secrets that could destroy him forever. Would I have the courage to crash my own son's wedding in front of hundreds of people? And what would I discover about his bride that was so shocking it would change everything? The phone buzzed at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and I almost ignored it. I was standing in my kitchen in Millbrook, stirring honey into my coffee, when I saw Kieran's name flash across the screen. My 28-year-old son rarely texted before noon, so something felt off, immediately. I set down my ceramic spoon and picked up the phone with fingers that were already trembling, though I didn't know why yet. "Mom, wedding's in 3 weeks. Don't come. We're live streaming. Link attached. K." I read it once, then twice, then a third time, each reading making the words feel more impossible, more cruel. My coffee mug slipped from my other hand, hitting the granite countertop with a sharp crack that sent honey-sweetened coffee splashing across my white kitchen cabinets. I didn't even notice. All I could see were those 13 words that had just turned my world upside down. Don't come. After 35 years of being his mother, 35 years of scraped knees and bedtime stories, school plays and graduation ceremonies, heartbreaks and triumphs, this was how I learned I wasn't welcome at his wedding to Sage, a woman I'd met exactly twice. The link led to some fancy wedding website with elegant fonts and watercolor florals. That probably cost more than most people spend on their entire ceremony. There it was, buried in the ceremony details section like an afterthought. Due to intimate venue constraints, we're sharing our special day virtually with extended family and friends. Extended family. That's what I'd become. Extended. Optional. Easily excluded. I called him immediately, my hands shaking as I pressed his contact. Straight to voicemail. His voice, warm and familiar, asked me to leave a message after the tone, but it felt like listening to a stranger. I tried again, and again, and again. By the fourth attempt, I was pacing my living room in my bathrobe, my bare feet wearing invisible paths in the Persian rug that Kieran had helped me pick out just 2 years ago. Back then, he'd spent entire Saturday afternoons with me at furniture stores, patient and kind, helping me choose pieces for my new life as a widow. He'd been so gentle during those months after his father's death, checking on me daily, bringing groceries when I forgot to eat, staying overnight. The silence in the house became too heavy to bear alone. "What about this one, Mom?" he'd said, running his hand along the soft wool of the rug we'd eventually chosen. Dad would have loved the colors. Now I was being discarded like yesterday's newspaper, pushed aside for people who mattered more. The wedding website had photos from their engagement party, an event I'd learned about through Facebook 3 days after it happened. Sage looked radiant in a designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Kieran stood beside her in an expensive suit that made him look uncomfortable, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. When had my boy, who once spent entire summers reading fantasy novels in our backyard hammock, become someone who attended parties where everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine? I scrolled through more photos, each one feeling like a small knife to my heart. There was Sage's family, her mother, Eleanor, elegant and imposing, her father, Harold, distinguished, in the way that old money breeds, her brother looking like he'd never worked a day in his life. They were the kind of people who belonged in country clubs and charity galas, who spoke in careful syllables and never seemed to sweat. And there was my Kieran, trying so hard to fit into their world that he'd forgotten he had a mother who loved him exactly as he was. But as I stood there in my living room, holding that phone and feeling the familiar ache of abandonment crawling up my throat, something else stirred in my chest. Something I hadn't felt in the 7 years since losing my husband Marcus. A fierce, protective determination that reminded me exactly who I used to be before grief had dulled my edges. I wasn't always the quiet, accommodating woman I'd become. Before sorrow had softened me into someone who said okay to everything and no to nothing, I was Delilah Chen Morrison, the woman who built a catering empire from nothing, who fought for every contract, who once drove 16 hours straight through a blizzard to deliver a wedding cake because I'd given my word. Marcus used to say I was like a velvet hammer. Sweet on the surface, Dee, but you get things done when it matters. Well, this mattered. My son mattered. Our relationship mattered, even if he'd forgotten that, somewhere along the way. I looked at that text message one more time, letting the hurt wash through me completely. Then, I deleted it, walked to my bedroom, and started planning. I knew exactly what I was going to do. But first, I needed to remember who I used to be. I walked to my home office, past the framed photos that lined the hallway, pictures of happier times, when my family was whole and my son still called me when he was excited about something. My fingers found the light switch and the room came to life, revealing the space, where I'd once run a business that employed 12 people and catered some of the most important events in the tri-state area. The desk was mostly clear now, just a few bills and my laptop, but I could still remember when it was covered with contracts and menu plans, when the phone rang constantly with clients, begging me to save their celebrations. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I'd packed away, along with Marcus's cologne and favorite coffee mug. I opened my laptop and started typing Kieran's name into Google. If my son was living a life I didn't recognize, then maybe it was time I got acquainted with the version of him that existed, online. What I found made my stomach twist into knots. Photo after photo showed a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else entirely. There was Kieran at expensive restaurants, looking uncomfortable in designer shirts that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Pictures of weekend trips to the Hamptons, where he stood stiffly beside Sage on pristine beaches, his smile looking more like a grimace. Charity galas where Sage posed in gowns that sparkled under crystal chandeliers, while Kieran tugged at bow ties that seemed to be choking him. When had my boy, who once spent entire rainy afternoons helping me test new cupcake recipes, become someone who attended polo matches? I clicked through to their engagement announcement, which had been featured in some fancy magazine called Town and Country. The article was full of flowery language about Manhattan's newest power couple and Sage's impeccable philanthropic credentials. Kieran was described as an emerging tech entrepreneur, though I knew his app development company was still struggling to land its first major client. The engagement photos showed them at what looked like an exclusive country club, all perfect lighting and practiced poses. Sage's diamond ring was so enormous it looked like it might weigh her hand down. But it was Kieran's expression that broke my heart. That polite, distant smile I'd never seen him wear before Sage entered his life. In the comments section, dozens of people I'd never heard of offered congratulations using words like divine and absolutely stunning. Not one person mentioned that the groom had a mother who loved him. I scrolled back through months of posts, looking for any trace of the son I recognized. Finally, buried in photos from 8 months ago, I found it. A picture Kieran had taken of a sunset from our old hiking trail, the one we used to walk together every Sunday after Marcus died. The caption was simple, "Missing the simple things." That post had 3 likes. His engagement announcement had gotten 400. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, where I kept the shoebox of photos I'd been meaning to organize for years. My hands moved automatically to the pictures from Kieran's childhood, each one a reminder of who he used to be when he was just mine. There he was at 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, while helping me ice cupcakes for his school bake sale. The kitchen had been covered in more frosting than the cupcakes, but he'd been so proud of his wobbly roses and crooked stars. At 16, rolling his eyes but still letting me take a dozen photos before his prom date arrived. "Mom, you're embarrassing," he'd said, but he'd straightened his tie one more time and smiled for the camera. At 22, crying in my arms after his college girlfriend broke his heart over video chat. "What would I do without you, Mom?" he'd whispered into my shoulder. "You're the only person who really knows me." What indeed? I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't called in over a year. Vivian Santos. Vivian had been my business partner for 8 years, and my closest friend for even longer. She'd helped me build Chen Morrison, catering from a side hustle into a thriving company, and she'd been one of the few people brave enough to keep showing up during the dark months after Marcus's funeral. Since then, she'd been trying to coax me back into the world of the living, sending invitations to art gallery openings and book clubs that I always politely declined. "Delilah," she'd say during our brief phone calls, "you can't grieve forever. Marcus wouldn't want you to disappear." But I had disappeared, hadn't I? I'd become so small and quiet that my own son felt comfortable excluding me from the most important day of his life. "Delilah?" Vivian's voice was surprised but warm when she answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you're finally ready to rejoin the human race. I need a favor, Viv, a big one." "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, feeling something wake up inside me that had been sleeping for too long. "I need you to help me crash my son's wedding." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Vivian's laughter rang through the phone, rich and delighted and completely familiar. "Now that's the Delilah I remember," she said. "Tell me everything." As I began to explain what had happened, I felt pieces of myself clicking back into place. The decisive woman who never backed down from a challenge, the mother who would fight heaven and earth for her child, the partner who knew how to turn impossible situations into victories. Kieran might have forgotten who I was, but I was about to remind him. And this time, I wasn't taking no for an answer. Vivian arrived at my house the next morning with 2 large coffee cups and the kind of determined expression that had made her legendary in the catering world. She'd always been my opposite. Where I was careful and methodical, she was bold and intuitive. Where I planned every detail, she trusted her gut and improvised. But together, we'd been unstoppable. "First things first," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there. "We need intelligence. You can't storm a castle without knowing its defenses." She pulled out a notebook and started writing as we talked. The wedding venue was Thornfield Manor, a converted estate about 2 hours north of the city. Their website showcased sprawling gardens, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers, and promises of intimate gatherings for discerning taste. "Translation, expensive and exclusive," Vivian muttered, scrolling through photos on her phone. $75,000 for a weekend rental, I said, reading over her shoulder. "Plus catering, flowers, photography." "Kieran doesn't have that kind of money." Which means Sage's family is footing the bill. But as we dug deeper into the Morrison family's online presence, pieces of a different puzzle started falling into place. Sage's family hotel empire wasn't doing as well as their social media suggested. Several properties had closed in the past 2 years, and business websites mentioned restructuring and market challenges. "Look at this," Vivian said, pointing to her laptop screen. "Every expensive dinner Sage posts, every designer outfit, every vacation. They're all tagged with brand partnerships or sponsored content. My stomach dropped. She's not actually wealthy, she's performing wealth. And doing a good job of it. But look closer at the dates. Vivian was right. The sponsored posts had increased dramatically over the past year, right? Around the time Sage had started dating Kieran. What had once been occasional partnerships had become a constant stream of advertisements disguised as lifestyle content. I called my accountant, Janet, who'd handled both my business and personal finances for 15 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Hypothetically, I said when she answered, if someone wanted to research a business's financial health, what public records would be available? Delilah, Janet's voice was cautious. What are you planning? Just answer the question. She sighed the way she did when I asked about tax deductions that sounded too good to be true. Hypothetically, bankruptcy filings are public record. Business licenses, property records, tax liens, all accessible if you know where to look. It took her less than an hour to find what I was looking for. The Morrison Hotel Group filed for Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Protection last month, Janet said when she called back. They're about $6 million in debt and most of their properties are in foreclosure. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. $6 million? There's more. The family's personal assets are tied up in the business. Their house, their cars, even Sage's trust fund. It's all collateral for business loans that they can't pay back. After I hung up, Vivian and I sat in my kitchen, staring at each other across a table covered with printed articles and financial documents. So, Sage's family is broke, Vivian said slowly. And Kieran has a successful tech company, plus the life insurance money from his father's death, plus the money from when I sold the catering business. I felt sick. He's exactly the kind of financial lifeline they need. But there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I went back to the wedding website, scrolling through vendor credits and ceremony details. There it was, buried in small print at the bottom of the page. Event planning by S. Morrison, Events. Viv, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Sage is planning her own wedding and billing it as a professional service. Vivian leaned over to read the screen. That's not just dishonest, that's fraud. She's using wedding expenses as business deductions while her family's company is in bankruptcy. I grabbed my phone and called Kieran's number again. This time, he answered on the second ring. Mom! His voice sounded tired, defeated. I figured you'd call eventually. Kieran, sweetheart, can we please talk about this? I don't understand. Why I can't be there. It's complicated, okay? Sage's family has specific ideas about how things should be done. The guest list is really tight, and with their business obligations. What business obligations? The pause was so long I thought. The call had dropped. Just family stuff. You wouldn't understand. Try me. Mom, I have to go. We're meeting with vendors, and Sage gets upset when I'm late. Kieran, wait. I'm sorry about the text. I really am. But this is how it has to be. The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of the trap my son was walking into. He sounded like a stranger, careful, guarded, afraid to speak freely even to his own mother. He doesn't know, I said to Vivian. He has no idea what he's getting into. Are you sure? Maybe he knows about the money problems and doesn't care. I thought about the exhaustion in his voice, the way he'd said Sage gets upset when he's late, like he was walking on eggshells in his own relationship. No, I said firmly. This is my son, the boy who used to call me when he was having a bad day, who never made a major decision without asking my opinion first. If he knew Sage's family was using him to solve their financial problems, he would have told me. He would have asked for advice. So, what do we do? I looked at the wedding website one more time, studying the photos of Thornfield Manor's elegant gardens and exclusive amenities. Then I opened a new browser window and started typing. "We're going to that wedding," I said, "and we're going to give Kieran the information he needs to make his own choice." How? They're not exactly going to add us to the guest list. I smiled for the first time in days, feeling the old Delilah stirring to life. Remember how we used to handle impossible client requests? We found a way to give them what they needed, even when they didn't know they needed it. Exactly. I picked up my phone and started dialing. And I think Thornfield Manor is about to discover they need some last-minute catering assistance. Vivian arrived the next morning with a rental car and a mischievous grin that reminded me why. We'd been such successful business partners. She'd always thrived on impossible challenges. The bigger and more complicated, the better. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said, spreading a map across my dining room table, like a general planning a campaign. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No half measures." She'd already researched Thornfield Manor's operations, studying their website and social media accounts. The venue prided itself on exclusivity and discretion, which meant tight security, but also a certain predictability. Wealthy clients wanted their privacy protected, but they also expected their events to run smoothly. "Every high-end venue has the same weaknesses," Vivian explained, pointing to photos on her tablet. "Vendor entrances, service staff schedules, delivery windows that can't be disrupted. We just need to find the right opening." I showed her the financial documents Janet had found about the Morrison family's bankruptcy. Vivian's expression grew more serious as she read through the papers. "Delilah, this is worse than we thought. If they're this deep in debt, and if Sage is using wedding planning as a cover to pay for her own wedding..." She paused, looking at me carefully. "We need to understand exactly what your son is walking into." The idea sent a chill through me. I wanted to save Kieran, but did I have the right to potentially destroy his happiness? What if he knew about Sage's financial troubles and didn't care? What if he loved her despite everything? But then I remembered his voice on the phone yesterday, strained and careful, like someone walking on eggshells. That wasn't the voice of a man in love. That was the voice of someone trapped. We spent the morning making calls and gathering information. I contacted 3 of the Morrison Hotel Group properties where my catering company had worked years ago, confirming that they still owed us money from events we'd catered. Janet was right. As a creditor, I had legal standing to request information about their bankruptcy proceedings. Meanwhile, Vivian used her network of industry contacts to learn more about Thornfield Manor's operations. Within 2 hours, she'd identified their preferred florist, their rental company, and the catering service they used for most events. "Here's the interesting part," she said, hanging up from a call with someone at Elegant Events Catering. "The wedding is this Saturday and they're still scrambling to fill vendor positions. Apparently, 2 staff members quit last week, and they're desperate for experienced event coordinators." My heart started beating faster. "Are you suggesting..." "I'm suggesting that Chen Morrison Catering might be interested in providing last-minute staffing support for a discerning client. For the right price, of course." It was audacious. It was risky. It was exactly the kind of bold move the old Delilah would have made without hesitation. "What if we get caught? What if we don't try?" Vivian countered. "What if your son marries someone who's using him, and you spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have prevented it?" That afternoon, I called Thornfield Manor's events coordinator. Patricia sounded harried and desperate when she answered the phone. "We specialize in high-end events," I told her, using the confident tone that had once convinced skeptical clients to trust me with their most important celebrations. Discreet, professional, experienced with difficult family dynamics. "When can you start?" Patricia asked before I'd even finished my pitch. We'll be there Friday evening for setup." After I hung up, Vivian and I sat in my kitchen, staring at each other with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Are we really doing this?" I asked. "We're really doing this." That evening, I drove to the storage unit where I'd kept my catering equipment after closing the business. Everything was exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago. Black pants, white shirts, aprons, and the small silver name tags that had once made me feel professional and capable. I held up one of the uniforms, remembering the woman who used to wear it. She'd been confident, decisive, unafraid to fight for what mattered. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that she was still inside me, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As I packed the clothes into a garment bag, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A small photo that had somehow made its way into one of my old apron pockets. It was from Kieran's high school graduation, taken just moments after the ceremony. He was still in his cap and gown, grinning widely with his diploma in one hand and his other arm around my shoulders. "Thanks for always believing in me, Mom," he'd written on the back in his careful handwriting. "I couldn't have done this without you." I traced the words with my finger, remembering the pride I'd felt that day, not just in his accomplishments, but in the young man he'd become. Kind, thoughtful, genuine in a world that often rewarded the opposite. That was the son I was fighting for. Not the uncomfortable stranger in designer suits who attended polo matches, but the boy who used to help me test new recipes and who always called when he was having a bad day. Back at home, I found Vivian in my kitchen, surrounded by printed floor plans and vendor schedules she'd somehow acquired. "I've been thinking about our approach," she said. "We can't just show up and hope for the best. We need a strategy." She spread the floor plans across my table, pointing to different areas with a pen. "The ceremony is in the rose garden. Cocktails move to the terrace. Dinner is in the main ballroom. If we're working the event, we'll have access to all these spaces. And then what? We can't exactly interrupt the ceremony. We don't need to interrupt anything. We just need to be close enough to observe, to understand what's really happening. And if Kieran needs an ally..." She looked at me, meaningfully. "His mother will be there." I picked up the photo from Kieran's graduation, studying his young face. One more time. In it, I could see the man he was meant to become. Not Sage's vision of him, but his own authentic self. "Okay," I said, tucking the photo into my purse. "Let's go save my son." But as we finalized our plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to discover something even worse than financial fraud. The pieces of this puzzle didn't quite fit together yet, and I had a sinking suspicion that Kieran's situation was more complicated than either of us realized. Whatever we found at Thornfield Manor, I was ready to face it. After 7 years of being smaller and quieter than I really was, it was time to remember what I was capable of when someone I loved was in danger. Friday evening at Thornfield Manor felt like stepping into a fairy tale, the expensive kind where everything looked perfect on the surface, but something dark lurked underneath. The estate sprawled across perfectly manicured grounds, dotted with ancient oak trees and hedges trimmed into geometric shapes. As our rental car crunched up the gravel driveway, I caught my first glimpse of the main building, a massive manor house with ivy-covered walls and tall windows that glowed warmly in the twilight. Under different circumstances, I might have admired the beauty of it all. Instead, my stomach churned with nervous energy as Vivian parked near the service entrance. "Remember," she said, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror, "we're here to work. We keep our heads down, do our jobs, and observe. No confrontations unless absolutely necessary." I nodded, though my hands were already trembling as I gathered my things. It had been one thing to plan this sitting in my safe kitchen. It was another entirely to be here, about to infiltrate my son's wedding like some kind of spy. Patricia, the events coordinator, met us at the staff entrance. She was a thin woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of permanently frazzled expression that came from managing too many demanding clients. "Thank God you're here," she said without any greeting. "I've got a bride who changes her mind every 5 minutes, a groom who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a mother-in-law who keeps trying to upgrade everything to more expensive options." My heart clenched. That had to be Sage's mother, the woman who was apparently orchestrating this entire charade while her family's business crumbled around them. Patricia handed us temporary ID badges and launched into a rapid overview of our duties. We'd be working the cocktail reception and dinner service, which meant we'd be in the same spaces as the guests throughout the evening. "The wedding party is staying on site tonight," she continued, consulting her clipboard. "Rehearsal. Dinner starts at 7 in the private dining room. Wedding ceremony is at 4 tomorrow, followed by cocktails in the garden, then dinner and dancing in the ballroom." As she led us through the service corridors, I caught glimpses of the main spaces being prepared. Florists were arranging massive displays of white roses and baby's breath, while rental staff positioned gold chairs in perfect rows. Everything was elegant and expensive, exactly what you'd expect from a $75,000 venue. But there was something else, an undercurrent of tension among the staff that had nothing to do with normal pre-wedding preparation. "Is everything all right?" I asked one of the florists, a young woman who was muttering under her breath as she adjusted a centerpiece for the 3rd time. She glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "The bride keeps changing the arrangements. First she wanted all white, then she wanted pink accents. Now she's back to all white but with different flowers. We've had to remake half of these twice, and nobody's paying us for the extra work." That was concerning but not unusual. Stressed brides often made last-minute changes. But as Vivian and I continued our orientation, a clearer picture began to emerge. The caterer mentioned that the menu had been simplified at the last minute due to budget adjustments. The photographer seemed nervous, mentioning something about payment processing delays. Even the string quartet looked uncertain about their schedule. We were witnessing a wedding held together with hope and credit cards. During a brief break, Vivian and I stepped outside onto a service balcony that overlooked the main gardens. Below us, we could see guests arriving for the rehearsal dinner, well-dressed, people with the kind of casual confidence that came from never worrying about money. And then I saw him. Kieran stood near the garden entrance, wearing a navy suit that looked expensive but somehow wrong on him. His hair was styled differently, slicked back instead of the tousled way he'd worn it since college. And he was talking to a man I didn't recognize. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his phone like he was looking for an escape route. "There he is," Vivian whispered, following my gaze. "He looks—" I struggled for the right word. "Miserable." Woman in a flowing white dress appeared at Kieran's side, and I got my first clear look at Sage in person. She was beautiful in the way that money could buy. Perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless makeup, a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something brittle about her smile as she took Kieran's arm, something performed, about the way she tilted her head up at him for what was clearly a photo opportunity. As if summoned by the thought, a photographer appeared and began snapping pictures. Sage immediately transformed, her smile becoming radiant, her posture perfect. Kieran's transformation was less convincing. He looked like he was enduring rather than enjoying the moment. "We need to get closer," I said. "Delilah, I need to hear what they're saying. I need to understand what's happening to my son." The rehearsal dinner was held in a private dining room adjacent to the main ballroom. As part of the service staff, Vivian and I had legitimate reasons to be in and out of the space, refilling water glasses and clearing plates between courses. The conversation at the head table was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Sage's mother, Eleanor Morrison, dominated the discussion with stories about the family's rich history and tradition of excellence. Her husband sat quietly beside her, occasionally nodding but mostly staring at his wine glass with the hollow expression of a man watching his life's work disappear. Kieran contributed little to the conversation, responding when directly addressed, but otherwise seeming lost in his own thoughts. At one point, I overheard him telling the man seated next to him, apparently Sage's brother, that he was still getting used to all this. "All what?" the brother asked with a smirk. "The whole scene," Kieran replied, gesturing vaguely at the opulent room around them. "It's not really my world, you know." The brother laughed, but not kindly. "It's Sage's world. If you want to be with her, you'd better get comfortable with it fast." I had to grip my water pitcher tighter to keep from dropping it. The casual cruelty in that statement, the implication that Kieran needed to change himself to be worthy of this family, made my blood boil. But it was what happened next that truly broke my heart. Sage stood to make a toast, her champagne glass glinting in the candlelight. She spoke beautifully about love and partnership and the bright future they were building together. But as she talked, I watched Kieran's face, and I saw something that made my chest tight with recognition. It was the same expression he'd worn at his father's funeral, the look of someone going through the motions because he didn't know what else to do. My son wasn't just marrying the wrong woman. He was disappearing into a life that was slowly erasing who he really was. And tomorrow, I was going to do something about it. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed custom-ordered for outdoor weddings. I woke at 5 a.m. in the small staff quarters Thornfield Manor provided for overnight vendors, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. Vivian was already up, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and her notebook, reviewing the timeline we'd memorized the night before. Ceremony at 4, cocktails immediately after in the Rose Garden. Dinner service starts at 6:30, she recited quietly. The Livestream setup is in the back corner of the ceremony space. 2 cameras, 1 stationary, 1 mobile. I'd spotted the Livestream equipment during yesterday's setup, a modest arrangement that seemed almost insulting given how elaborate everything else was. 2 small cameras and a laptop, managed by what appeared to be a college-aged intern who looked like he'd never filmed anything more complex than a birthday party. "Delilah," Vivian said, setting down her coffee, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I looked up from where I was adjusting my uniform shirt. "What exactly are you planning to do today?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding even in my own mind. The truth was, I didn't have a concrete plan beyond being present, being close enough to intervene if necessary. But intervene how and when? I don't know, I admitted. I just know I can't let him go through with this without at least trying to... To what? Stop the wedding? Kidnap the groom? 'Cause a scene that ruins everything? Her questions stung because they highlighted the fundamental flaw in my reasoning. I'd been so focused on getting here, on not being excluded, that I hadn't thought through what success actually looked like. "What if he's happy?" Vivian continued gently. "What if everything we think we're seeing is wrong, and he genuinely wants this life?" I walked to the window and looked out at the grounds, where staff members were already setting up chairs for the ceremony. In a few hours, this space would be filled with guests, watching my son pledge his life to a woman I barely knew, starting a future I couldn't understand. "Then I'll know," I said finally. "I'll see it in his face when he says his vows, and I'll accept it." "But, Viv, what if you're wrong? What if he needs someone to give him permission to walk away?" She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but promise me, Something. Promise me you won't do anything that could hurt him more than help him. It was a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, but I gave it anyway. The morning passed in a blur of preparation activities. I helped arrange place cards, polish silverware, and set up the cocktail stations while keeping one eye on the wedding party's movements. Sage had booked the Manor's bridal suite for herself and her bridesmaids, while Kieran and his groomsmen were using a smaller room on the opposite wing. Around noon, I caught a glimpse of him through a window, standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the gardens. He was already dressed in his wedding attire, a charcoal gray morning coat that made him look sophisticated but somehow smaller. His hands gripped the balcony railing, and his posture suggested someone steeling himself for an ordeal rather than celebrating the happiest day of his life. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Tyler, the videographer. Having some technical issues with the live stream. Might be delayed." I stared at the message, my heart racing. The live stream was the only way I was supposed to witness my son's wedding. And now even that was in jeopardy? I found Tyler in the ceremony space, crouched over his equipment with the kind of panicked expression that suggested the technical issues were more serious than might be delayed. "What's wrong?" I asked, crouching beside him. He looked up, surprised to see a staff member taking interest. "The internet connection keeps cutting out. I think it's the weather or something. I've got maybe 30% reliability, which means the stream will keep dropping." "What about recording it for later?" "I can record locally, but that defeats the purpose, right? People want to watch it live." An idea began forming in my mind. A terrible, wonderful, completely insane idea. "What if there was another option?" I said carefully. "What if some of the people who were supposed to watch online could be here in person instead?" Tyler shrugged. "I guess that would work, but it's kind of last minute to change plans, isn't it? Not if you were the kind of person who once drove 16 hours through a blizzard to deliver a wedding cake." I excused myself and found a quiet corner to make a phone call to Janet, my accountant. "Janet? Remember those Morrison Hotel Group bankruptcy documents you found? I need you to do something with them. Today." "Delilah, what are you—" "File a creditor's petition. Emergency status due to potential asset transfers that could affect the debt recovery." "Asset transfers? What asset transfers?" "The ones that might happen when Sage Morrison becomes Sage Chen and potentially gains access to her new husband's financial accounts." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "That's actually not completely unreasonable," Janet said finally. "If there's a pattern of using marriage to avoid creditor obligations, a judge might want to examine the situation. But Delilah, this is serious legal territory. If you're wrong about any of this, then I'll face the consequences. Can you do it?" Another pause. "Give me 2 hours." By mid-afternoon, guests had begun arriving for the 4 o'clock ceremony. I watched from the service entrance as cars pulled up the circular drive, discharging elegantly dressed people who moved with the casual confidence of old money. I recognized some faces from Sage's social media posts, society connections, family friends, business associates. But I also noticed who wasn't there. No college friends of Kieran's, no co-workers from his tech company, no one who looked like they belonged to his world rather than hers. The guest list wasn't just exclusive, it was erasive, systematically, editing out the person Kieran had been before Sage. At 3:30, I positioned myself at the back of the ceremony space, ostensibly to assist with any last-minute needs, but really to have a clear view of everything that was about to unfold. The string quartet began the processional music, and guests rose as the wedding party made their entrance. First came Sage's bridesmaids, 4 perfectly coordinated women in blush-colored gowns. Then Kieran's groomsmen, Men I didn't recognize, who I assumed were Sage's connections rather than his friends. And then Kieran himself appeared at the altar, escorted by Sage's father since his own father wasn't alive to fulfill that role. Seeing him standing there, looking handsome but hollow, I felt a sharp pang of loss for Marcus, who would have known exactly what to say to our son in this moment. The music swelled, and Sage appeared at the back of the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. She looked radiant, every inch the perfect bride, as she began her walk toward a future built on foundations I increasingly suspected were made of sand. But it was Kieran's face that captured my attention. As Sage approached, he smiled, the polite, practiced smile I'd seen him wear all weekend. It never reached his eyes. My phone buzzed. Janet. Papers filed. Sheriff dispatched with summons, should arrive any minute. In that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. The ceremony began with all the pomp and elegance money could buy. The officiant, a distinguished-looking man in expensive robes, spoke eloquently about love and commitment, while guests sat in rapt attention. Sage and Kieran stood facing each other, holding hands, looking like the perfect couple from a wedding magazine. But I could see what the cameras couldn't capture: the slight tremor in Kieran's hands, the way his smile flickered when he thought no one was looking, the manner in which he kept glancing toward the back of the ceremony space as if searching for an escape route. The officiant had just launched into his remarks about the sacred nature of marriage when my phone buzzed silently in my pocket. I pulled it out just enough to see Janet's text. Sheriff en route, ETA 5 minutes. Papers served to venue first, then family. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd actually done it, set in motion a chain of events that would bring legal scrutiny to this wedding, and more importantly, potentially give Kieran the pause he needed to reconsider what he was doing. But 5 minutes felt like an eternity, as the ceremony continued its relentless march toward I do. Marriage is a sacred bond, the officiant intoned, his voice carrying across the pristine garden, built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. It requires both parties to come together with open hearts and truthful intentions. I almost laughed at the irony. Truthful intentions? This entire wedding was built on lies. If anyone knows of any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined in marriage, the officiant continued, speak now or forever hold your peace. The traditional words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This was it. The moment every mother dreams of and dreads, when you have to decide whether to trust your child's choices or intervene to protect them from what you believe is a mistake. I looked at Kieran's face, really looked, and saw something that made my decision for me. Relief. For just a split second, when the officiant asked for objections, I saw relief flicker across my son's features, the look of someone hoping, despite everything, that someone would save him from himself. I object. The words left my mouth before I'd consciously decided to speak them. My voice carried clearly across the pristine garden, and every head turned toward me in shock. Kieran's eyes widened, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and something that looked suspiciously like gratitude before settling on horror at the social catastrophe unfolding. "Mom?" His voice cracked on the word. "What are you doing here?" Sage's face had gone from bridal radiance to cold fury in the space of a heartbeat. "Who is this person?" she demanded, though she knew exactly who I was. I stepped forward, my hands shaking but my voice steady. "I'm Delilah Chen Morrison. I'm Kieran's mother, and I have something to say." "This is completely inappropriate." Eleanor Morrison rose. From her seat, her face flushed with indignation. "Security, remove this woman immediately." But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the chaos. Actually, ma'am, I think you'll want to hear what she has to say. A uniformed sheriff's deputy had appeared at the back of the ceremony space, looking apologetic but determined. He held a manila envelope in his hands and wore the expression of someone who really didn't want to be there but had a job to do. Eleanor Morrison, I have a court summons for you regarding creditor proceedings in the matter of Morrison Hotel. Group bankruptcy case. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Eleanor's face went white as snow. Her husband slumped in his chair as if all the air had left his body, and Sage's carefully constructed composure cracked like a dropped mask. I don't understand, Kieran said, looking between me, the deputy, and his bride-to-be. What's happening? What bankruptcy case? What's happening, I said, my voice carrying across the silent garden, is that you're about to marry into a family that's financially bankrupt and has been using this wedding as a business expense to avoid paying their creditors. The gasps from the assembled guests created a wave of sound that rippled through the ceremony space. Phones came out as people began recording what was clearly going to be the society scandal of the year. That's not true. Sage's voice was shrill, desperate. Kieran, don't listen to her. She's just a bitter old woman who can't accept that you've moved on. But Kieran wasn't looking at Sage anymore. He was staring at me with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the look he got when he was trying to solve a puzzle and had just been given the missing piece. The business expenses, he said slowly, his voice growing stronger. All those charges on our joint account that you said were for wedding planning. Kieran, let me explain. The venue rental that somehow qualified as a tax write-off. The photography package that was billed to your father's company. The catering that, he stopped, his face going pale. How much of this wedding is being paid for with my money? The deputy cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sir, if you're financially entangled with the Morrison family, you might want to speak with the court-appointed attorney handling their bankruptcy case. There are some irregularities in their filings that suggest… Enough. Eleanor Morrison's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. This wedding will proceed as planned. Whatever financial matters need to be discussed can be handled later through proper channels. She turned to the officiant, her expression imperious despite the circumstances. Continue the ceremony. But the officiant was already backing away, clearly wanting no part of whatever legal complications were unfolding before him. I'm sorry, he said, but given the circumstances, I think it would be prudent to postpone. No. Sage's voice was cold as winter, and when she turned to face me, her mask had completely slipped. Gone was the radiant bride, replaced by someone hard and calculating. You have no right to be here. You have no right to interfere in our lives. I have every right to protect my son from being used, I replied, stepping closer to the altar. And that's what this is, isn't it? You needed someone to pay for the lifestyle you could no longer afford, and Kieran was convenient. That's not… I love him. Do you? I looked directly at her, then at Kieran. Because love doesn't hide financial ruin from the person you're planning to marry. Love doesn't exclude someone's mother from their wedding. Love doesn't systematically isolate someone from their friends and family, so they become easier to manipulate. Kieran was still staring at Sage, and I could see the pieces clicking into place in his mind. The business loan you asked me to co-sign last month. You said it was for expanding your event planning company, but there is no event planning company, is there? Kieran. It's just you, billing your own wedding expenses as business costs while using my credit to cover what your family can't afford. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Sage's composure cracked completely. So what if it is? We're getting married anyway, so what? Does it matter whose money pays for what? Once we're husband and wife, you'll have legal access to all my assets, Kieran finished quietly. And your family's creditors will be able to come after them too. I watched my son's face as the full scope of his situation became clear to him. It wasn't just about money. It was about being seen as a solution to someone else's problems rather than a person worthy of love for his own sake. The deputy stepped forward again. "Sir, I really do recommend you speak with a lawyer before making any legal commitments that might affect—" But he never finished the sentence, because at that moment, Kieran did something that surprised everyone, including me. He started to laugh, not the bitter laughter of someone betrayed, but something lighter, almost relieved. He looked at Sage, then at her parents, then at the elaborate ceremony space around us. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "For months, I've been trying to figure out why I felt so wrong about all of this. The clothes, the parties, the people who only seemed interested in what I could provide, rather than who I was." He turned to face the assembled guests, most of whom were still filming with their phones. "I kept telling myself it was just wedding stress, or that I was being ungrateful for the life you were offering me, Sage. But it wasn't wedding stress. It was my gut telling me that something was fundamentally dishonest about this whole situation." What happened next was like watching a dam break. Once Kieran had acknowledged the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of his relationship with Sage, everything else began to unravel with startling speed. "The joint bank account," he said, turning back to Sage with a clarity I hadn't seen in him all weekend. "You opened it 3 months ago, said it was for wedding expenses, but there are charges going back before we were even engaged." Sage's face had gone ashen. Those were planning expenses, venue visits, dress shopping. "Rent payments," Kieran interrupted, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his banking app. "Utility bills, credit card payments, car payments. Sage, you've been using our wedding account to pay your personal expenses for months." The assembled guests had gone completely silent, transfixed by the drama unfolding before them. Several were still recording, though I suspected this wasn't the kind of wedding video anyone had expected to capture. Eleanor Morrison made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding that can be sorted out privately. There's no need to air family matters in public." "Family matters?" I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "You've spent the entire weekend treating my son like a convenient solution to your problems rather than a member of your family. You excluded his only living parent from his wedding, isolated him from his friends, and apparently have been systematically deceiving him about your financial situation." "We didn't exclude anyone," Eleanor shot back. "The Livestream was a way to keep inconvenient people at a distance while you completed whatever transaction this wedding was supposed to facilitate." The deputy stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama but duty-bound to complete his official business. "Mrs. Morrison, I still need to serve you with these papers. The court has ordered a review of all recent financial transactions, including any assets that might be transferred through marriage." That's when Sage's father, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "Eleanor, stop." His voice was quiet but carried clearly across the garden. "Just stop." He stood slowly, looking every one of his 60-odd years. "She's right. About all of it. Harold." "No, Elle. We've been lying to ourselves for months, and now we've dragged this young man into our mess." He looked at Kieran with something approaching shame. "Son, I'm sorry. This isn't what I wanted for my daughter, and it sure as hell isn't what you deserved." Harold Morrison walked toward the altar, his expensive morning coat hanging loosely on his diminished frame. "We lost everything 18 months ago. Bad investments, market changes, some decisions I'm not proud of." Eleanor thought, "We both thought that if Sage married well, it might solve some of our problems." "Daddy, don't—" "Sage, honey, it's over. The company's gone, the houses are going into foreclosure, and we can't keep pretending otherwise." He turned to address the assembled guests, many of whom were clearly family friends and business associates. "I apologize to all of you for the deception. The Morrison Hotel Group is bankrupt, and this wedding was—" He struggled for the words. "This wedding was as much about financial necessity as it was about love." The silence that followed was profound. I looked at Kieran, who was staring at his almost father-in-law with an expression of mixed pity and relief. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Kieran asked, his voice gentle despite everything. "If you were in trouble, if you needed help, why all the lies and manipulation?" Sage finally found her voice, though it came out small and broken. "Because I was ashamed. Because I loved you, and I was terrified that if you knew the truth about my family, you'd leave. So instead, you decided to trick me into a marriage. That would solve your financial problems." "It wasn't supposed to be a trick," I thought. "I thought once we were married, once we were really together, the money stuff wouldn't matter. I thought you'd understand." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke again, his voice was sad, but firm. "Sage, the money stuff wouldn't have mattered if you'd been honest about it. If you'd come to me and said, 'Your family was struggling,' if you'd asked for help instead of trying to manipulate me into providing it without my knowledge, we could have figured something out. But you would have seen me differently. You would have known I wasn't really—" "What? Wealthy?" "Sage, I never cared about your money. I cared about you being honest with me." I watched this exchange with a mixture of heartbreak and pride. Heartbreak for the genuine pain I could see in both their faces, and pride in my son for handling this impossible situation with more grace than most people twice his age could have managed. But there was still one more revelation to come. Vivian appeared at my elbow, having made her way through the crowd during the confrontation. She leaned close and whispered, "Delilah, there's something else you need to know." She handed me a piece of paper, a printed email that made my blood run cold as I read it. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Tyler, the videographer. He's been having technical problems all morning, and when he went to check the Livestream setup, he found this on Sage's laptop. It was still open." The email was from Sage to someone named Marcus Chen, dated 3 days ago. The subject line read, "Re-background check on K. Morrison." But it was the content that made my hands shake. "Marcus, thanks for the information. On Kieran's financial situation. The life insurance payout from his father was larger than I expected, and the catering business sale brought in more than he initially told me. With his tech company starting to show profit, he's actually worth significantly more than our initial assessment. This changes our approach. We need to accelerate the timeline and ensure access to joint accounts before he has time to reconsider. The wedding is this weekend. We'll contact you Monday to discuss next steps. S." I stared at the email, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't just opportunistic financial manipulation. It was calculated, premeditated fraud. "Kieran," I said, my voice carrying across the garden with deadly calm, "you need to see this." I handed him the paper and watched his face change as he read. The last vestiges of hurt and confusion disappeared, replaced by something harder and more final. "You had me investigated," he said, looking at Sage with something approaching disgust. "You searched my finances like I was a potential business acquisition." Sage's face crumpled. "Kieran, I can explain." "No." His voice cut through her protests with quiet finality. "There's nothing to explain. This—" He held up the email. "This isn't love. This isn't even opportunism. This is fraud." He turned to the deputy, who had been watching the entire exchange with professional interest. "Officer, If someone tricks someone into marriage under false pretenses with the intent to gain access to their financial assets, what would you call that? I'd call it something you should definitely discuss with a lawyer, sir, and probably with the district attorney's office. Kieran nodded and began walking down the aisle, away from the altar and the woman who had nearly succeeded in trapping him in a marriage built on lies. As he passed me, he stopped and took my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "I know this wasn't easy, and I know I haven't been myself lately. But thank you for not giving up on me." "I will never give up on you," I replied, squeezing his hand. "That's what mothers do." Together, we walked through the crowd of stunned guests toward the exit, leaving behind the elaborate wedding that had never been about love at all. But as we reached the edge of the ceremony space, Sage's voice rang out behind us, desperate and shrill. "You'll regret this, Kieran. You're walking away from everything I could have given you." Kieran stopped and turned back one final time. "No, Sage," he said quietly. "I'm walking away from everything you were going to take from me." 3 hours later, Kieran and I sat in a small cafe about 20 miles from Thornfield Manor, still wearing our formal clothes, but finally able to breathe freely. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, leaving us both exhausted but oddly peaceful. "I keep waiting to feel devastated," Kieran said, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. "I was supposed to get married today. I was supposed to be starting my new life as a husband. Instead, I'm sitting in a diner with my mother, and all I feel is relief? Yeah, how messed up is that?" "It's not messed up at all, sweetheart. It means your instincts were working even when your heart was confused." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching late afternoon sunlight stream through the cafe windows. Outside, ordinary people were going about their Saturday routines, grocery shopping, walking dogs, living simple, honest lives that suddenly seemed infinitely more appealing than the world of manufactured elegance we'd just escaped. "I owe you an apology," Kieran said eventually. "For the text, for excluding you, for... God, Mom, for almost marrying someone who had me investigated like a potential business investment. You don't owe me anything except honesty going forward." "I haven't been honest, though. Not with you, not with myself." He ran his hands through his hair, messing up the careful styling for the first time all weekend. "I knew something was wrong. Months ago. The way Sage always wanted to go to expensive places but never seemed to pay for anything. The way she'd get angry when I suggested staying in for a quiet night. The way she talked about our future like it was all about what we could afford rather than what we wanted to build together. What changed your mind? What made you ignore those instincts?" Kieran was quiet for a long time, considering the question. I think I was lonely. After Dad died, after you went through that really hard period where you barely left the house, I felt like I'd lost both my parents in a way. And then Sage came along, and she was so confident, so sure about what she wanted. It felt good to be wanted that intensely, even if I didn't understand why. The confession hit me like a physical blow. In my grief after Marcus's death, I'd been so focused on my own pain that I'd failed to see how my withdrawal had affected my son. "Kieran, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize..." "Mom, no. You were grieving. You needed time to process losing Dad. I understood that, even if it was hard." He reached across the table and took my hand. "But I think that's why I was so vulnerable to someone like Sage. She made me feel necessary, important, even if it was for all the wrong reasons." "And your friends? The people from your real life?" "I pushed them away. Sage always had something to say about them. They weren't ambitious enough or sophisticated enough or whatever. She had a way of making me feel embarrassed about the people and things I used to enjoy. He shook his head ruefully. I can't believe I let that happen. It's easier than you think to lose yourself in someone else's vision of who you should be, I said, thinking about my own journey back to the person I'd been before grief had dimmed me. The important thing is recognizing it and choosing to find your way back. My phone buzzed with a text message. Vivian. Hotel situation resolved. Sage and family checked out. Tyler says he'll delete all footage from today. Apparently he felt bad about the whole thing. You two okay? I showed Kieran the message, and he managed his first genuine smile of the day. Your friend Vivian is formidable, he said. Remind me never to get on her bad side. She's the one who helped me figure out how to crash your wedding. I couldn't have done any of this without her. So you really worked at the venue as catering staff? For 2 days. Your mother still has some moves when the situation calls for it. Kieran started laughing. Real laughter this time, the kind that had been missing from his voice for months. I can't believe you went undercover at my own wedding. That's the most incredible thing I've ever heard. I prefer to think of it as resourceful. Mom, you literally filed legal documents to stop my wedding. That's not resourceful, that's like something out of a movie. As he laughed, I saw glimpses of the son I remembered, the one who used to help me test recipes and who called when he was having a bad day. The expensive clothes and perfect styling couldn't completely hide the person underneath, and I felt a surge of hope that we could find our way back to each other. So what happens now? I asked. Kieran considered the question seriously. Well, first I need to call a lawyer about the financial stuff. If Sage really has been using our joint accounts for her family's expenses, I need to understand what my exposure is. And after that, he paused, looking out the window at the ordinary Saturday afternoon unfolding outside. After that, I think I need to figure out who I actually want to be, instead of who someone else thinks I should become. Any ideas where you want to start? Actually, yeah. He turned back to me with an expression that was both hopeful and nervous. I was thinking about the catering business. I know you sold it after Dad died, but I've been wondering, would you ever consider starting it up again? Maybe as partners this time? The suggestion caught me completely off guard. Kieran, you have your tech company, which is doing okay, but it's not my passion. It never was. I started it because I thought I should be entrepreneurial, because it seemed like the smart career move. But the truth is, some of my favorite memories are of helping you with events when I was younger. Remember that wedding, where the cake collapsed an hour before the reception? I laughed despite myself. And you helped me rebuild it using drinking straws and dental floss. And it turned out better than the original. The bride still sends us Christmas cards. His expression grew more serious. I've missed that, Mom. I've missed working with you, being part of something that made people happy instead of just profitable. The idea was tempting in ways I hadn't expected. For months, Vivian had been trying to coax me back into some version of professional life, and I'd resisted because I couldn't imagine caring about work the way I had before Marcus died. But the thought of building something new with Kieran, of having a reason to see him regularly, of sharing the kind of partnership Marcus and I once had, sparked something in me that had been dormant too long. It would be a lot of work, I said carefully. Starting over, building a client base, dealing with all the stress and long hours. I know, but we'd be doing it together. Partners? Partners. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in months, and saw someone I recognized. Not the uncomfortable stranger in designer clothes, but the thoughtful, generous young man who had spent his childhood helping me turn flour and sugar into celebrations. Okay, I said. Let's plan a wedding. But this time, It would be the right kind of wedding, the kind built on love instead of lies, truth instead of deception, joy instead of financial calculation. There's just one condition, I added with a smile. What's that? Next time you get married, I want an invitation. A real one. Kieran grinned, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. Deal. But let's focus on other people's weddings for a while. I think I need some time to remember who I am when I'm not trying to be someone else's perfect partner. That sounds like the wisest thing anyone said all day. As we sat in that little cafe, planning our future and leaving the wreckage of his almost wedding behind us, I realized something important. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the thing that saves you. Sometimes you have to almost lose everything to remember what really matters. And sometimes love means knowing exactly when to speak up instead of forever, holding your peace. The morning of our first major event as Chen Morrison Catering felt like stepping back into a life I'd thought was gone forever. I stood in the industrial kitchen we'd rented, watching Kieran carefully pipe frosting onto individual petit fours while humming under his breath, a habit he'd had since childhood whenever he was completely absorbed in a task. These look incredible, I said, admiring his work. When did you get so good at decorating? YouTube, he admitted with a grin. Turns out there are tutorials for everything. Who knew? The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of paperwork, equipment purchases, client meetings, and the gradual reconstruction of both our professional lives and our relationship. Kieran had moved back to town, renting a small apartment just 10 minutes from my house, and we'd fallen into an easy rhythm of partnership that felt both familiar and entirely new. The legal aftermath of his almost wedding had been complicated, but not devastating. Sage had. Indeed used their joint account for family expenses, but the amounts were manageable, and Kieran's lawyer had been able to recover most of the money through the bankruptcy proceedings. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that Kieran wasn't the first young man the Morrison family had targeted. There was a pattern of behavior that had caught the attention of federal investigators. I got a text from Tyler yesterday, Kieran said, carefully placing another petit four on the display tray. Remember the videographer from Thornfield Manor? The poor kid who was supposed to livestream your wedding? That's him. Apparently, he started a whole business filming what he calls authentic weddings. His tagline is real love, real stories. He credits our disaster with inspiring him to focus on genuine couples instead of just pretty pictures. I laughed, shaking my head. At least something good came out of that day. Mom, a lot of good came out of that day. He was right, though it had taken months for me to see it clearly. The woman who had marched into Thornfield Manor and stopped. A wedding wasn't the same person who had been quietly accepting whatever crumbs of attention her son was willing to offer. She was someone I'd forgotten I could be, decisive, protective, unafraid to fight for what mattered. Our first client had been Vivian's niece, a sweet 24-year-old who wanted a small backyard wedding with homemade food and mason jar centerpieces. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just 40 people celebrating love without pretense or performance. It's so refreshing, the bride had told us during our planning meeting. Everyone keeps asking if we want something more elaborate, more impressive. But honestly, we just want good food and the people we care about most. That wedding had led to 3 more bookings, then 6, then 12. Word was spreading that Chen Morrison Catering specialized in events that prioritized substance over spectacle, the kind of celebrations where people actually remembered the food instead of just photographing it. Today's event was our biggest, yet a 50th wedding anniversary party for a couple who had specifically requested none of that fancy nonsense, just good food and enough tables for everyone to sit down comfortably. Are you nervous? Kieran asked as we loaded the last of the equipment into our delivery van. Terrified, I admitted. But it's the good kind of terrified, the kind that means you care about doing something well. I know exactly what you mean. The anniversary party was being held in the couple's backyard, which had been transformed, with string lights and borrowed tables, into something both elegant and comfortable. As we set up the buffet, I watched the guests arrive, 3 generations of family members, longtime friends, neighbors who had become chosen family over the decades. "Look at that," Kieran said quietly, nodding toward the anniversary couple. They were in their 70s, married for 50 years, and still holding hands as they greeted their guests. "That's what it's supposed to look like, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" "Love, partnership, the way they look at each other like they still genuinely enjoy being together, like they're still choosing each other every day." I studied my son's face, seeing something thoughtful and hopeful that had been missing during his relationship with Sage. "You'll find that," I said. "When you're ready, when you meet someone who sees you for who you really are, instead of what you can provide." "I'm not in any hurry," he replied. "I'm actually enjoying getting to know myself again, remembering what I like, what I want, who I am when I'm not trying to become someone else's ideal partner." As the afternoon progressed, our food disappeared steadily, and compliments flowed freely. The anniversary couple made a point of finding us during the reception to thank us personally. "This is exactly what we wanted," the wife said, her eyes bright with happiness. "Food that tastes like love, not like a restaurant trying too hard to impress anyone." "That's the nicest compliment we could ask for," I replied, meaning it completely. Later, as we packed up the equipment and leftover food, Kieran and I worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing each other well enough that conversation isn't always necessary. "Mom," he said eventually, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" "That day at Thornfield Manor when you stood up and objected to my wedding? It was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. And not just because of the legal stuff or because you were right about Sage. It was brave because you chose to fight. For our relationship even when I'd been pushing you away." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "I was terrified I was making a mistake. What if you'd been happy? What if I'd ruined everything?" "You saved everything," he said simply. "You saved me from a marriage that would have been a lie. And you saved us from losing each other completely." He paused in his packing and looked at me directly. "But mostly, you showed me what unconditional love actually looks like. Not the kind that says I'll support whatever makes you happy, but the kind that says I'll fight for you even when you can't fight for yourself." As we drove home in the gathering dusk, our successful event behind us and the promise of many more ahead, I realized that the text message that had shattered my world 6 months ago had actually been the beginning of finding it again. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you really are. And sometimes, love means trusting your instincts and speaking up, even when everyone else is telling you to stay silent. My phone buzzed as we pulled into my driveway. A text from a potential new client. "Hi, we heard about you from the Andersons. We're planning our daughter's wedding and want something real, not fancy. Can we talk?" I showed the message to Kieran, who smiled and reached over to squeeze my hand. "Ready for the next adventure, partner?" "With you? Always." As we unloaded our equipment and planned our next celebration, I thought about all the weddings we'd cater in the years to come. Real weddings, built on honest love and genuine joy. Weddings where families came together instead of being pushed apart, where the focus was on the beginning of a life together, rather than the performance of wealth or status. Weddings where mothers were invited, not excluded. Weddings where love was real, not calculated. And if I ever sensed that a couple wasn't right for each other, If I ever saw signs of deception or manipulation, I knew exactly what I would do. I would speak up. Because that's what love does. It protects, it fights, and it refuses to stay silent when someone it cares about is in danger. That's what mothers do, and I would never apologize for it again. Word count, 1,050. And that's how I learned that sometimes the worst day of your life can become the best thing that ever happened to you. Sometimes love means speaking up when everyone expects you to stay quiet. I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and tell me your city or country. It always amazes me how these stories of love and family connect us all around the world. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. When you subscribe, you're helping us spread more stories of kindness, courage, and real love to people who need to hear them. Every like and subscribe helps another person find hope when they're facing their own difficult family situations. You're literally spreading kindness with just one click. And speaking of family stories that will surprise you, check out the video appearing on your screen right now. You won't believe what happens when a daughter discovers her mother's been lying about something huge for 20 years. Click it now. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is fight for the people you love.